Hey, welcome to another story time. Today, we're going to read the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. It's been a while since I have read this book, so I'm going to do my best to explain it to you accurately. Um, it's really a book about immigration, amongst other things, but immigration and what it means to be an American. At least that's part of it. It was written by a woman named Betty Smith in 1943. It became an immediate success, huge success. It was made into a movie, I think, in 1945. Um, and it's crazy. You can see, this is in the middle of World War II. And there were a lot of copies of the book being passed around amongst the soldiers, especially in Europe. So, also knowing that it's written by Betty Smith, a woman, is important to know. And as you'll see through the story, women are the strongest characters in the book. There's some men too, and it seems like a real natural story of how men and women interact and the strengths and weaknesses of them. But when you take a step back, I think, and you realize like who are the strongest people, who are the most important people in the story, it seems like it's all the women. And there are some women who are not as well. So I guess that's a good thing. So the family that we're going to learn about, the Nolans, they lived in Brooklyn, New York. And the story begins in 1912, and it's going to jump around a little bit, but the first chapter's in 1912. Serene was a word you could put to Brooklyn, New York, especially in the summer of 1912. Somber as a word was better, but it did not apply to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So somber is more of a sad thing. It's a sad word, sad connotations to it. And so just how the Nolans lived, those kind of sad, downtrodden and all that. Late in the afternoon, the sun slanted down into the mossy yard belonging to Francie Nolan's house and warmed the worn wooden fence. Oh, what a great sentence. So I just put some of these sentences in for you to see how Betty Smith writes. And you can see how great a sentence that is. Late in the afternoon, the sun slanted down into the mossy yard belonging to Francie Nolan's house and warmed the worn wooden fence. Love it. So Francie is a young girl. She is 11, I think that might mean, or maybe I thought she was 12, but somewhere in there. And what she's a young girl, so she would go around the neighborhood and collect junk. But then she would take to the junk dealer to sell on Saturdays, and they would get a few pennies or a nickel or something. She had a younger brother named Neely. I think Cornelius was his full name, but they called him Neely for short. And because they're hauling this junk around, that they're made fun of along the way in the streets. This is like one of the first humiliations that they have to deal with. This idea that they're so poor, and if they wanted any extra money like this, then they had to collect garbage and walk through the street. Imagine this, walking through the street with the garbage you're going to sell. And I shouldn't say garbage. Garbage makes it sound like, things people threw out in the dumpster or something, but it's more like, like old lamps or things like that. Okay. So I want to read this whole quote, not only, again, to get an idea of how the book is written, but also talk about the point of the title, Tree Grows in Brooklyn. The one tree in Francie's yard was neither a pine nor hemlock. No matter where its seed fell, it made a tree which struggled to reach the sky. It grew in boarded up lots and out of neglected rubbish heaps, and it was the only tree that grew out of cement. You saw a small one of these trees through the iron gate leading to someone's yard, and you knew that soon that section of Brooklyn would get to be a tenement district. The tree knew. It came there first. Afterwards, poor foreigners seeped in, and the quiet old brownstone houses were hacked up into flats. Feather beds were pushed out of the window sills to air, and the tree of heaven flourished. That was the kind of tree it was. It liked poor people. So hopefully you're getting kind of an idea of what kind of life the Nolans lived here. So with the money that Francie had made with the junks, they would usually then go to like the five and dime store, the nickel and dime store, to buy candy or something. And you could see here on page 11 that she talks about she had this nickel. Francie had a nickel. Francie had power. Money was a wonder thing, she decided. So this is the beginning when she realized that, the family lives in poverty and they were poor, and that money could mean a way out of this, or it could mean some power that they had. So yeah. They go home. Their mom is there. Their mom's name is Katie. Their father's name is Johnny. So Johnny and Katie are the parents of Francie and Neely. Johnny Nolan, it should say. Johnny Nolan was a handsome, lovable fellow, far superior to any man on the block. But he was a drunk. That's what they said, and it was true. So this is one of the problems. Katie is a pretty good mother, and except she has one flaw, which we'll talk about in a minute. Johnny is a loving father, but he can't really handle life, and he drinks a lot. And this is going to be a problem, obviously, to the family. One day, Johnny didn't come home for dinner. Francie had to go and buy the food for the day, and she did that a lot. And they usually had to buy stale bread, and sometimes had to make a deal on stale bread. And so again, imagine being that age, or being the age, almost being a teenager, where every day you're reminded of the how poor you are. And I love this, that, she saw this old decrepit man on a bench and was afraid that she was going to get old and end up that same way. And so she wanted to make sure that she didn't. And we'll see if she does. They love the library, which we'll get to in a minute. There's a great scene here in the first chapter where so some of the boys in the neighborhood are teasing a Jewish kid, and Neely, the son, starts to make a distinction between that. There's when you're at that age, and Neely's probably about 8 or 9, I think. When you start to realize that there are differences between us, whether it be religious or color, and he's kind of confusing all these and trying to figure out what all these mean. Like, why would you tease another white kid? He understood about how you might tease people because of race or whatever, but this whole thing about religion was kind of confusing to him. As they're walking along, the family, Neely, Francie, and Katie, the mom, the daughter, and the son. There was a boy selling pretzels, and this is one of those, again, instances where, when you're a kid and your mom has to constantly tell you, no, you can't have these things. And so, again, just constant reminders of who you really are. Katie loved the library. Francie loved the library. And so I love this quote here. She liked the combined smell of worn leather bindings, library paste, and freshly inked stamping pads better than she liked the smell of burning incense at high mass. Francie thought that all the books in the world were in that library, and she had a plan about reading all the books in the world. She was reading a book a day in alphabetical order and not skipping the dry ones. So I love this. I love this quote too, because it makes you think about the difference between religion and intellect. And is there can those things exist together? Can you be an intellectual and know about the world and still value your religion, or is there some conflict there? And I loved how the fact that she's reading a book a day in alphabetical order, except on Saturdays. She allows herself to go in on Saturdays to read what she wants to read. And she always asks the librarian for recommendations, and it's hilarious because the librarian keeps recommending the same ones, even the ones that she's already read. But she rereads them anyways. Yes. It is in this chapter too that Katie, the mother, reveals that she prefers the son better than Francie. Francie's a sickly child, especially when she was a baby, and so demanded, required a lot of time and attention, while Neely was more robust, more independent, more energized, more active. But Katie promised herself, the mother promised herself, that she would never let her daughter know that she preferred Neely. And this is interesting to me too, because I have 3 brothers. And growing up, I never even considered, I wonder if they like one of us better than another one. And there was no evidence that they ever did, my parents. But I wonder, how could you not? I don't know. Think about that. They had to move, the Nolan family had to move a lot because of Johnny, because of the father, because of how he drank so much and how he caused problems in the little areas that they grew up, or that the family lived. There was also one incident where one of Katie's family members tried to babysit, and they caused some problems too. And so they constantly had to move. And we also find out that Katie and Johnny are both immigrants at this time. Johnny is from Ireland. Katie is from Austria. And so we start to lay the roots of these families. And the roots, again, back to the title of the book as well, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, that you're not only who you are at that moment, that there are connections that go back many generations. Johnny was a waiter, and maybe we'll get back to that in a minute. But there's this one incident where Johnny, the father, took his daughter Francie to the union headquarters once and talked about himself. He might have been a little drunk, but he says, "I want to tell you fellows that I got a couple of fine children home and a pretty wife, and I want to tell you that I'm not good enough for them." And so it's not like Johnny knew that Johnny did know that he really wasn't like the ideal father, and he recognized that, but he never really did anything about it. And he says, "This is why. I drink because I don't stand a chance, and I know it. I'm not a happy man. I never wanted a family." And tells this to Francie, his daughter. So again, imagine all the things that Francie's a special child, right? She's smart. She's doing all this reading. She's aware of the world, and yet she's reminded daily about the poverty in which she lives. She has a horrible father who loves her, but can't really be a father, and now tells her this, that I never really wanted you in the first place. Katie, more than Johnny, commits that they want to create and give their children a better life, which I think probably is something that all parents want. Maybe this is kind of like part of the American dream, this concept of, I want my children to be better off than I was, whether that be financially or professionally or spiritually or psychologically or whatever you want to say. But there is this commitment here early in the book, about a third of the way into the book, that Katie does reveal that this is really her only goal. And there's some evidence of this. There's an incident where there's a child murderer or child rapist in the neighborhood that Katie takes care of to protect Francie. So imagine having to do that. I think, having to use violence to protect your children. And so this is certainly all about Katie. So Katie's about. Then Katie announces that she's pregnant again. And Johnny, again, who never really wanted a family, who's not a very good father, really doesn't want this to happen, goes out and drinks. Um, he catches pneumonia and he dies on Christmas, I think 1914. Katie uses the life insurance policy to um, bury him. Most of it goes to bury him, but also has some money left over to kind of get the family back on some stable footing. Later that spring, into the summer, the daughter Annie Laurie is born. It's the same day that Francie graduates from middle school. And think things are going in the right direction. But Francie can't get into high school, so or they can't afford high school. I forget. I think it's they can't afford high school, so she gets a job. I forget what her first job is. Her second job she gets is in a newspaper clipping department. And back in the day when like every day the newspapers would be printed and someone would go through, a bunch of people would go through and clip out the articles, and then they would put the articles in folders so that when people were doing research on a certain thing, they would just go to the folder and all the clippings would be there. So that's what her jobs was. This is before the internet where you could just do a Google search. You actually had to go to a physical place and go to the folder and pull out a folder of, I don't know, dogs or dog shows, and there would be all the clippings of the dog shows of New York or whatever, so you could do the research easily. In fact, we used to have that in the Lakeview High School library when I was a student there many years ago. Mrs. Lincoln had these folders of clippings and things. Anyway, she remembers clipping news stories out about World War I, and with the outbreak of World War I, the newspaper declines and her job is eliminated. And so she decides she wants to go to college, just skip high school and go to college. So she becomes friends with a college student and studies to try to get into college and does well on the test, but yet is not accepted. It's about this time that Katie's sister, Sissy, shows up. Sissy is quite a character. She is, so Katie being like dedicated to her family, Sissy really is not. And it's not that she's a bad mom, but she's really like excited about the world and engaged in the world and energized, and kind of like Neely is. She's had 10 kids who all had died after childbirth. And she revels. Sissy revels in the world. She revels in life. And so instead of when they talked about the stale bread for their meals, while in the past it was more like stale bread again, Sissy brought some excitement to it about how excited she was to what she could make with stale bread. Let's see what's important here. You can kind of see that we find out with the interaction between Katie and Neely Katie and Sissy, that Francie and Neely had to read a page of the Bible and a page from Shakespeare every night before to bed. And again, thinking about is there this conflict between intelligence and education versus religion? And so I'll let you think about that one. We also find out that Johnny, who's dead, and about how his life was. When Johnny first met Katie, Johnny was going out with Katie's best friend, but Katie stole her. She understood why people had to lie and steal and harm one another. She knew of all the pitiful human weaknesses and of many cruel strengths. This is talking about Katie. And maybe this is what like attracted her to Johnny, even though knowing who Johnny was and how he wasn't a good father, wasn't going to be a good father, and that he was a drinker. She kind of understood why he was that way, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, we learned about Sissy, who was first married when she was 14, pregnant within a month of getting married, and this process happened over and over and over again. Um, um, yeah. So we get back to Johnny. Johnny's father died when he was 30. He had two brothers, so there was three brothers. They were called the Singing Waiters, and they all had trouble dealing with their father's death. You can see one was drunk, one died of an accident, I think. Johnny was the only one who lived past his 30th birthday. I love this quote here near the end of the book. By the way, the book is pretty short, so Um, Katie's maiden name is Romilly, and so you see that here. And the child, Francie Nolan, was all of the Romillys and all of the Nolans. She had the violent weaknesses and the passion for beauty of the Shanty Nolans. She was made up of more too. She was the books she read in the library. She was the flower in the brown bowl. Part of her life was made from the tree growing wrinkly in the yard. She was the bitter quarrel she had with her brother, whom she loved dearly. She was Katie's secret, despairing weeping. She was the shame of her father staggering home drunk. And I love this paragraph because, you know, when you start to think about who you are or who the person sitting next to you is, like what has made them who they are. And they're not just who you see in that moment, right? They're not just, people aren't that simple. Human beings are not that simple of just, this is who that person is. There's so much more to them that have gotten to that point. And so, as I was telling you about Johnny Nolan, for example, how he was a drinker and not a very good father, you immediately, hopefully, probably had this like, oh, he's not a good guy. But then you find out about his father's death and then his brother's deaths, and like you feel the tragedy that has occurred in his life and what he has had to have go through, how he has processed this. I'm not saying that he processed it good, but those are the struggles that he was going with. And now when you think of Francie and you think about all of the things that she is, so she's all the things about her mother, and she's all the things about her father, and she's all about the poverty, and she's about the books, and there's so much that goes into her that one quick look at her is not going to be good enough to define who she is. So when we get to near the end of the book, Francie is growing up. She tries to make connections with some men, and one is just a friend. His name is Ben. Another one is a visiting Marine who kind of takes advantage of her and makes her think that he loves her, but she doesn't. Katie, her mother, remarries and marries a Marine, an ex-Marine, who's a great man, who's a very good man, who immediately adopts Annie Laurie, the younger child. And they get like the life that they've always wanted. Neely continues his education. He seems like he's going to be fine. Francie finally gets accepted into the University of Michigan, where she goes to further her education. And Katie is sitting in the house and looks out at the tree, and where the first tree was that we talked about at the beginning of the book. And that tree has since been cut down, but a new one has grown in its place. And I think that is a good way to end the book. So think about some of the themes here, the coming of age, of all the things that might impact children as they're growing up, of who they are, whether it be poverty or teasing and bullying, or what kind of parents you have, or the education level that you have, or all of those things. How much do they have to do with your coming of age and becoming an adult? Certainly there's this power of education, and I like how it's always maybe compared to religion. And so think about those two things, about, is education the way out? Is becoming smarter? Is there a way out of some of the troubles that you're in? The meaning of family is very important in this. You know, is it a good family? Is it a bad? What does family mean? What is a good family? What's a bad family? Who gets to define that? This concept of the American dream. What is the American dream? We see these immigrants from Italy and Austria who come over to the United States and start to build a life. And is there such thing as an American dream that's common throughout? I would love to have you try to understand what that is and maybe define this in your analysis. The impact of poverty, that holds people down, that diminishes people, that makes them feel less. And I wonder how that might instruct how you see the world today. And certainly this concept of love. Can you love someone even though you treat them poorly? And I think Johnny Nolan's a great example of that, who clearly loved his family but just couldn't be a good father. And then the dedication of Katie to her children. Is that love or is that something else? So you can analyze that too as well. But thanks for listening. But that brings us to the end of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Again, a great novel from the 1940s. Um, um, in the midst of a world war, when the world is trying to figure out what what they're all about as well, and what the future of the world should be about. And I'm not sure if you can even apply the analogy of the tree being cut down and a new one growing in its place to even what's going on with World War II. But I'll let you think about that. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.